Well, hello, amazing parents, and welcome to another exciting episode of Graceful Parenting. I'm Amy Hayes, your host and guide, and this is the program where we talk about what the Bible really says about parenting. And it's not what you've been hearing in church. And that's good news because the traditional way of Christian parenting is not producing good results. And I say that because studies have shown for the last several decades that 2 out of 3 children raised in what we call Christian homes under traditional Christian parenting are walking away from the church and turning their backs on God as young adults. So the results are proving that our method is flawed because God doesn't give us odds like that. God doesn't lose. He always gives us the victory. So if 2 out of 3 of our children are walking away, then we have to stop and step back and say, what is it that we're doing that's wrong? So if you're joining me for the first time, welcome. You have a little catching up to do. I have recently published a book called Graceful Parenting, and we're going through that book chapter by chapter. This week, we're on chapter 10. So we're well into the book. If you haven't seen any previous episodes, go back and watch them through the on-demand feature of this network, and you can grab your copy of the book and the workbook, which is now available through the QR code or the website on the screen. So this week, we're going to talk about the one thing that every child craves and can only get from his parents. And this one thing is the secret to success in every aspect of life for all of us. And we either get it or we don't when we're kids. And it's very difficult, like many of the other things we've talked about. What happens in our early childhood lays a foundation for our entire life, and it's very difficult to make up for what was lacking during those years. So if you didn't get this one thing when you were a child, you'll start to recognize it as we go through this lesson and realize how important it is. This one thing is so important. I call it the rocket fuel to successful parenting, because it will establish success in your child's life in every aspect of his life. So what is this one thing? Well, last week we talked about identity and how establishing identity is the goal of parenting. And it's the first and primary thing that parents need to do in order to raise their children, to grow up knowing who they are, because everything we do flows from who we are, who we believe we are. Well, that answers the question that we all have when we come into the world: who am I? And so a parent's job is to answer that question. And you do answer it by the way you interact with your child in those formative years. And so you're communicating to him who he is, his identity. Well, the second question we all have is, who I am have any value? In other words, okay, you told me who I am. I know who I am, but do I bring anything to the table? Do I bring anything to the planet? Why am I here? We all want to know. That's the big question of life. What's the meaning of my life, right? Why am I here? Like, I wake up every day and I go, okay, God, why am I awake today? Why am I awake today? What are we doing today? There's a purpose in every day and every breath God gives us. So this leads us to the topic of value. How do we instill value in our children? How do we let them know that who they are does have value, intrinsic value, in fact, unique value that no one else brings to the mix, to the body of Christ? And the one thing that we're going to talk about today communicates value better than anything I know. So, if your child doesn't get this one thing from you, they're going to go looking for it in all the wrong places. The lack of this one thing is what causes children to do drugs, join gangs, become promiscuous, and all those, destructive behaviors that we dread as a parent. We hope our children don't get into those. But the good news is, when you give this one thing to your child, it will naturally prevent them from being drawn to those behaviors. Why? Because if you communicate value to your child, if your child values himself, well, you just think about anything you value, you naturally guard and protect it. So if the value you see in yourself would determine where you go and what you do. So a child who sees his value up here is not going to participate in behaviors that are beneath him, that are beneath his value, doing drugs, gangs, all those sort of things, criminal activities, vagrancy, whatever you want to call it. And so by instilling this one thing, this value in your children, you're naturally inoculating him against those behaviors. So what is this one thing that communicates value better than anything else? Well, I'll tell you what it's not. It's not love. You can actually love your child dearly, and most parents do. But without this one thing, your child may not even know that you love him. In fact, I had a relative who one of their children was in therapy because they were having some parenting issues. And the therapist came to the parents and said, your daughter knows you love her. She needs to know this one thing. So what is this one thing? This one thing that communicates love better than anything else is parental approval. And this therapist said, she needs to know you approve of her. So you can love your child, but if they continually get these messages of disapproval, they will think you don't love them, because that's how we communicate love to someone. In fact, I heard years ago a Catholic priest said that the best description he had of love was acceptance. In other words, I accept you as you are. I approve of you. Now, I don't think acceptance and approval are completely equivalent, but it's similar, and it's along the same lines. Is that you can say you love people, but if you don't approve of them, then you're not communicating that love. I'm getting a little off track. Let me stay on point here because we don't have a lot of time. So every child needs to know they're good enough. They need your stamp of approval. And sadly, most of our parenting methods send the opposite message. We're telling them we disapprove. You're not good enough. You're not measuring up. We point out where they're wrong, where they fall short. We shame them. We punish them. God never does these things. He never shames us. He never condemns us. He never punishes us. He never points out where we're wrong. In fact, God always starts with approval. He starts from approval. We don't have to earn it. I can prove that to you. It was while we were yet sinners that Christ died for us. Jesus said, I didn't come into the world to judge. I came to save. He didn't come to judge our behavior and point out everything we did wrong, so you need to do better. No, he came to save us. So God approved of us while we were yet sinners. He saw the value in us while we were sinners. While we were behaving very badly, he sent his son to die for us because he saw the value in us. And how do you know the value of something? You look at the price tag. What's the price that God paid for us? The very life of his own son. So that's what we're worth to God. That's our value. It's equivalent to the value of the life of Christ. So we can see God's approval in the scriptures at Jesus' baptism. Before Jesus did one miracle, healed one sick person, preached one sermon, God speaks from heaven and says, this is my beloved son in whom I am well pleased. He's like, I'm pleased with you just because you're my beloved son. So there's that identity statement and the approval. Who he is, you're my beloved son. And I approve of you. I'm pleased with you. You don't have to do anything. You see, because if approval depends on behavior, then it's always changing. And the child's behavior is always in question anyway. So he feels very disapproved of. But when approval is based on identity, it never changes because your identity never changes. So identity is what gives us value, not behavior. Excuse me, something's tickling my nose. So last week we talked about adults looking for something outside of themselves to give themselves value, identity, and purpose, like a profession, occupation, even ministry. But because they've never known who they were, they didn't see the value, their intrinsic value, and just who they were created by God to be. You see, we're human beings, not human doings. And this whole doing culture is very American, very Western. Other cultures don't ask, what did you do today? And I learned this from my daughter who teaches English as a second language. And she has students all over the world that she teaches online. And she said when she first started teaching, she would ask, how are you today? Because it's a conversational method of teaching. And then she would ask them, what did you do today? And she said, I would always get this quizzical look like, what did I do today? So you see, most cultures don't have this doing mentality like the Western mindset has. We're all about doing. What'd you do? What do you do? It's all about performance, probably because of the way we were raised, which is also a very Western mindset. So here's the reality is that you will never outperform your view of yourself. So how you see yourself determines everything from what you do to how you interact with others, and how your ability to maximize your potential. I saw this years ago. I was involved in this multi-level marketing company, and every week we had our meetings, and I'd go to the meetings, and there was this one lady, and every week she'd bring 7 or 8 new people to the meetings that she was introducing to the business, and I was very jealous. She'd have a whole row of her guests, and I might have one, if that. Well, she was moving up the ranks very quickly, and we were all just in awe of her. Well, one day, all of a sudden, she stopped showing up, and I asked somebody, I don't even remember her name, where is she? And they said, oh, well, she went back to cleaning houses, which is what she did before she joined this organization. She was making some good money. But when you don't see yourself as that valuable, you will naturally default to where you see yourself. The Bible tells us this. It says, as a man thinks in his heart, so is he. So it's what you believe about yourself in your heart. It's the truth of who we are is what God says. But most of us don't have that in our heart. So we're operating at a very low level, lower level than our potential. That's what I saw with my kids. I wasn't a perfect parent, far from it. But I intuitively got this one thing right a lot of the times, not even all the time. But that's the good news, is like, you don't have to be a perfect parent to make a huge difference in how your children turn out. Because most of us, we were parented under that old mentality, the performance-based, behavior-focused parenting. And all that does is tie your value and worth to how good you can be, how well you can perform. But one by one, I watched my kids as they slowly seemed to pass me up one by one. And I thought, what is it do they know about life that I don't know? And what it was, it's what they knew about themselves, that they were good enough. And so even though they grew up in very, very difficult and challenging circumstances, they turned out to be these stable, like focused, they have stable families and jobs and careers and things, and just very stable life that I didn't have. See, that's the interesting paradox in my life, is that I grew up in a home that looked very stable on the outside. So my parents, they stayed married for life. I lived in the same house my entire childhood till I got married. We went to church every week. They had very stable religious practices, holidays and holy days, and Sundays we were at church, and we had our home rituals that we did, and I had a private school, private music lessons, all these extracurricular, and my parents were, well-known, upstanding members of the community in the church, and it just looked like the ideal, formula for a successful adult. But I grew up to be a very unstable adult. I was married and divorced 3 times. I moved more times than you could ever count. Never went to college, even though I was very smart. I had so many troubles you can't even count. Financial troubles, bankruptcies, abusive relationships, you name it. And that's what my kids grew up in. So you'd think that they would have been unstable, but it was the opposite. They got the one thing that I didn't get, which was that parental approval. Here's the rub, is that, my parents were very well-meaning. They did the best they could with what they knew, but there's no such thing as constructive criticism. And no matter how well I did as a child, I always heard how I could do better. And that does not spur a person on. All it does is make you feel like you're not good enough. And that's how I felt. I graduated from high school second in my class, but I felt like the biggest failure on the planet. And I still struggle with that. So it's not what you give your kids on the outside that's going to make the difference. It's what they believe about themselves on the inside. And I'll reiterate what the scripture says, that as a man believes in his heart, so is he. So it isn't your true identity. Our true identity is given by God, and it's amazing. It's what you believe about yourself. So you could be a millionaire. Maybe you have an inheritance you don't know about. And so in reality, you are a millionaire, but you don't know it. And you think your worth is based on your bank account, which has maybe $45 in it. But you're really worth $1 million. But you think you're worth 45. So you're going to live like you're worth $45. And that's a very natural example, that is a good example of the same thing about everything we do in life. We will never outperform what we believe about ourselves. So when you focus on your child's behavior, then he, like we have said, he believes that his value and worth is tied to his behavior, which as a child, they can't control that. And there's so many factors they don't choose. Like we all have a certain physical ability, cognitive ability, and things like that. But young children, they're not even choosing their behavior. Their behavior is as automatic as breathing. So when we communicate to them that their value is based on their behavior, which they can't control, the only logical conclusion a child can come to is, I'm flawed. There's something wrong with me. All I ever hear is where I fall short, what I've done wrong, what I didn't do, what I should have done. And it's all these negative messages that just chip away at that value and worth. So what your child needs to hear is his true identity, because that never changes. So made in God's image never changes. Unique expression of God's heart never changes. Designed for a unique purpose that no one else can fulfill never changes. So if you think about even your child's physical DNA, genetic makeup, that you can't change that. So yes, he's going to be born, in an infant state, but his genetic code is going to develop over time into the fullness of that genetic coding. Well, you can't change that. So the foundation of your child's spiritual identity, true identity in Christ, never changes either. But are you going to nurture that and develop that, or are you just going to leave it lie there? Because even in the physical, we nurture our child's development through nutrition and exercise and environment and activities that maximize his physical potential. We have to do the same with their spiritual identity. And we have to nurture that with the main ingredient, parental approval, telling them that who they are is good and that we approve of them. So how do we do that? Well, there's a lot of ways we can do that. Just like we've talked about many times, it starts with your mindset that you see them as having equal value and worth as you, because they do. That God doesn't see, they don't have less value in God's eyes than we do. In fact, as we've said, God told us to look at them as the model for entering heaven. Like you must become as a little child to enter the kingdom of heaven. So in a sense, we should be looking to them as an example instead of, continually telling them that they're not good enough. So their value and worth is there, but are we communicating it to them? So it's just your facial expressions, the things you say. Do you condemn or do you correct? Condemn or correct? Do you overpower them and try to control them, or do you empower them to be self-directed? And I'm not talking about ignoring behavior. And I've reiterated that several times. No, hopefully by now, especially in last week, you learned how to create the behaviors you desire. And if you need more information on that, get the book and the workbook, and that'll walk you through it. And look on my website for upcoming workshops to help you apply these concepts, because I only have limited time on these broadcasts. But I want to get this in before we are done. Just the example of God starting from approval. When Jesus was baptized, before he'd done a miracle, before he taught one sermon or healed one sick person, God said, "You're my beloved son in whom I'm well pleased." And you might be thinking, well, yeah, but Jesus was perfect and my child's not. Well, your child is perfect in God's eyes because Jesus said he's fit for heaven. So instead of looking at his behavior, you look at his spiritual identity. So the reality is that all of us either work from from approval or for approval. And if you think about this and just kind of watch yourself and watch other people who work for approval, it's a striving. You're always trying to, get the boss's attention, get moms to look at you, notice what I'm doing, and wanting other people to validate you because you don't know who you are. You don't know you have value, right? So people who work for approval are fearful because the approval depends on their performance. And if they fail at something or they don't do well, then the approval may not be there. So that's that fear of that rejection, lack of approval. They become timid. They're afraid to try new things because if I try something new and I mess up, then I won't get the approval that I'm craving. Because we all crave approval. In fact, studies show that even into adulthood, there's a deep-seated need for parental approval. You've probably seen that in yourself. You want your parents to be proud of you, even after you get married and have kids and you're on your own. You still want your parents' approval and affirmation. So insecure. I mean, you're very insecure when you're working for approval, because, like I said, you never know if you're going to get it or not. You have this victim mentality because you're expecting other people to validate you instead of knowing who you are in Christ for yourself. And you become people pleasers. People who are working for approval are perfect abuse victims. I mean, at worst, because you're looking for someone who wants to dominate you and tell you who you are, and you don't do this consciously, but it happens. If you grow up with that insecurity and that people pleasing, you'll do whatever other people demand to try and get that approval. So it's a setup for, people pleasing at best and abuse at worst. But those of us who work from approval, who know who we are in Christ, we're fearless because we know that our approval doesn't depend on what we do. So you become risk takers. These are the leaders in society. They're willing to take risks because they know that failure does not reflect on them and their value and worth, that their value and worth is inherent. They're confident. And their world, these are the world changers. If you want to raise world changers, then you need to be sure that you are communicating approval to your child so that they have that confidence, that fearlessness, that risk-taking, ability to do things outside their comfort zone. Those are working for approval. Stay in the safe. They're going to stay where it's safe, and they know that just go through the motions. Do those things you can do. Don't do anything risky. So then it just limits our potential so much when we're working for approval. So once again, I want to say I'm not advocating that you ignore bad behavior. Pat your child on the head and say, "Oh, you're made in God's image. You just tore up the room or hurt your sibling or whatever." No, not at all. But hopefully by now you've learned how to change behavior, or even create behaviors you desire by speaking those things into existence and creating your child's identity so that he lives from that identity. Like I taught my son to be obedient by telling him he was obedient. So I have a few minutes left. Let's go back and talk about how do you communicate value to your child. Let me just pull up a little list I have here handy. Oh, wait, it's right here. So how do you communicate value? A lot of it, like I said, it starts with your mindset. You have to see the value first. Just facial expressions, smiling at your child for no reason. Just telling them you're glad they're there. You're such a blessing. I like having you around, doing things with your kids, getting down, playing on the floor with them, because you're saying that your world has value to me. I'm going to stop doing my mom things and sit on the floor and build a block tower with you, or color a picture, or paint, play a game. So doing things with your child, expressing gratitude for him, just because he is, not for things he does, but for who he is. Now, there's a fine line there. Like the other day, my son brought some things in from the car without me asking him. He just saw them in there and knew that I like, whenever I get home, I take everything out of the car. I don't leave stuff in my car. So when I get in, it's nice and clean. And so he brought some things in the house, and I said, instead of saying, "Oh, thank you, you're so helpful," or "Thank you for bringing those in," it's hard for me to switch because I try to stay in the positive. Or instead of, "Oh, I appreciate you bringing those in," instead of speaking to the behavior, say, "Thank you so much, you're so helpful." So I'm speaking to identity. I'm describing him. He's helpful. That's who he is. So there's that fine line. You can say, "Thank you for bringing those in." There's nothing wrong with that. But then the child thinks that you're thankful for him when he does things. But if you say, "Thank you so much, you are so helpful," you're creating that identity. You're speaking into who he is and sending that message of approval that you appreciate that. So that's a good example of, that fine line between addressing behavior, even when you're being positive. Now, it's kind of obvious in the negative, to correct instead of condemn. But sometimes there's that fine line. Ask for their help. Another way to show approval. Ask for their help, even when they're 2 years old, 3 years old. "Oh, could you get me that whatever over there?" Just even though you don't need them to help you, ask them for their help, and that communicates to them that they have value. They can help you. Ask for their opinion, their ideas, their thoughts, and just talk about them. Consider them, even if they're outlandish. Just talk about them as if, oh, that's a good idea, and just we'll think about that. Let's see, what else? Also, acknowledging and appreciating their unique qualities. We talked a little bit about that last week. Giving them age-appropriate responsibilities. Always did that with my kids. As soon as they're able to walk, they can put something in the trash for you, right? Or pick something up off the floor. Foster independence. And that goes along with the appropriate responsibility. Don't do everything for them. I'm guilty of overmothering. I have a special needs child, and he's 21 years old now, and I still do a lot of things for him just because I always have. And I feel like I've hindered him because he can learn some of these things if I would just take the time to allow him to try. So I'm trying to do that more. So let them be independent. Honor their feelings. We're going to talk about that. Is it next week? I think next week. Honor their feelings. We're going to learn how to do that. Emotions have gotten a bad rap in the church. So we really need to learn how to address feelings and not be afraid of them. Positive correction instead of calling out the wrong, just correct it. We talked about in that previous session too. And then just tell them what you believe and think about them. Often we think great things about our kids, but we're not communicating it to them. And so just talk about it. And so those are some ways you can communicate value, is just treating them with respect and honor, just the way you want to be treated, right? It's not rocket science. So anyway, let's see if I have anything else back here. Right, so that's about it for today. Next week, we're going to talk about the one thing that causes all conflict with your children and with anyone. And to me, it's like obvious, but no one's talking about this, at least that I know of. And because we've been focused on behavior instead of getting to the source of behavior, we've also missed the cause of the conflict. And so once you'll see it, you'll wonder, is that all it is? And you'll be much better equipped to respond effectively when conflict arises. So thanks for joining me today. Until next week, take care and God bless.